Welcome to The Last American Vagabond. Joining me today is Robert Inlakesh to discuss what's going on in Israel and Gaza and give us insight into some of the things that he's been seeing that maybe we haven't talked about, other insights on some of the amazing articles he's put out for The Last American Vagabond, and in general, just to have a conversation with him, because in my opinion, he's got a special insight into this conversation, both personal and just journalistically. So how are you, Robert? Good to see you, man.
Great. Thanks for having me, and it's great to be back.
Yeah, well, let's start with what's obviously going on in Rafah. I think this is, in my opinion, one of the hardest parts of this to cover. It's been not necessarily the most amount of people killed, but easily one of the hardest parts of this to see take place, where people are being burned alive in their tents. So let's just start with that in general. What's going on in Rafah right now, and what's your take on, the dynamics of it, and what the arguments, and that's an important point I want you to highlight, the arguments of what started it from this point forward in regard to Hamas rockets and where that all ties back to, and the claim of where they were fired from.
Well, I suppose we can start with that, and that's the incident that just happened, obviously a few days ago now. And that, I believe, like you said, was in response to this massacre of 45 people. There's others who were seriously burned and seriously injured who may die of their wounds. Originally, the statistic was put at 50. That was the estimate, so they were pretty close. And they bombarded an area in western Rafah, which is supposed to be a UN designated zone. It's an UNRWA, next to an UNRWA logistics facility, and was supposedly, according to the Israelis, a safe zone. So when they hit it with, I believe, 7 missiles, were the reports that we saw at the time, they massacred civilians. We actually came out with the image of a beheaded baby, which, of course, this was the infamous Israeli propaganda hoax about Israeli beheaded babies, and a confirmed image that Joe Biden allegedly saw back in October. Now Joe Biden can actually look at a confirmed image of terrorists beheading a baby, I could argue, and make his judgments there. But of course, this doesn't change the way that the United States actually views this. They gave essentially the green light for the Israelis to go into Rafah. And the Israelis, in my opinion, committed this massacre, they will say, because they wanted to target 2 people who were members of Hamas, who were from the West Bank, one of whom I believe was killed either in that strike or another one close by. There wasn't confirmation of where he was exactly killed, because there were a number of strikes that night. It wasn't just in Rafah where the strike was on the tent. They also killed people in Gaza City. They attacked Jabalia. I believe they bombed Beit Hanun as well. There was attacks there, and there were other strikes in Rafah which were committed as well. On top of this strike, the original narrative was, well, this strike was committed in accordance with international law. We went after these Hamas members, and even we could go into this alleged, Hamas member and his relevance. He's not somebody that's in the chain of command. He was formerly operating in the West Bank as one of the leaders in the West Bank of Hamas. He was arrested and then he was deported afterwards to the Gaza Strip, and he is not a member who is operating as a Hamas militant or anything like that. And even if he was, even if they were going after him amongst people in tents, that's still a violation of international law, and they still knew exactly what was going to happen. These are people sheltering in tents in a UN zone, in a Israeli designated safe zone, and so there's no excuse. But then, of course, when the backlash came in, the international backlash, Netanyahu read the room and he said, we made a mistake, but we're still going to go ahead with our invasion of Rafah. And like you noted at the start with the rocket fire, earlier that day, Hamas had just fired rockets from the Rafah area. They were trying to claim they were fired from civilian areas, which was just absolutely ridiculous. But they fired these rockets and they hit north of Tel Aviv. They didn't kill anyone. There were reports of 3 injuries. These were very light injuries. These were not serious injuries. I believe one of them I saw was confirmed that somebody fell over when they were running because they sirens, for instance.
Right.
These are not serious injuries. One of them made a little bit of damage. It hit a Israeli house, and it made a little bit of damage to that house. But ultimately, what Hamas was doing was demonstrating that you have not degraded our weapons capabilities. We can still hit Tel Aviv. After 8 months of what you have done here, with massacring over 40,000 people, claiming that you've dismantled us in all these different areas, we can still fire rockets from the south of the Gaza Strip and hit the north of Tel Aviv. And it was a message. And it came the day after in the Jabalia refugee camp that the Al-Qassam brigades of Hamas, the armed wing, announced that it had captured, killed, and injured Israeli soldiers in an ambush. And it appears that these were special forces soldiers. So the fact that they were able to capture a soldier the day before, as announced, and video evidence was published of that, and also that they were able to fire these rockets at Tel Aviv so late into this conflict, where Israel, we're talking about, we've almost dismantled Hamas, was a huge disgrace. And it appears that this was the knee-jerk response to bomb civilians in densely populated tent area where people are sheltering.
And then on top of that, we have to remember as well the idea that the ICC, the ICJ, the push, I think the ICJ in particular, are ordering them to stop. It's hard to miss the timing of that, to almost respond as if, no, we won't, and to carry this out. But I think it's important to focus on the location there. So obviously, I saw statements from Hamas saying that they fired in between IDF locations, but I've referenced your statement as well to argue that. So give us your background on that, and what do we know about what we have to verify or not where these came from? Because the argument they're using to claim, which again, your point needs to be heard, even if they did fire from that location, it does not give them a justification to murder a bunch of people sleeping in their tents. But what do we know about that, and break that down for us so we know, that where they claimed it came from and how we know that?
Well, they're not obviously going to give the precise coordinates of where they fired the rockets from, so we're not going to get a precise location. However, what we can see is that they fired them from an open area. You can see this from the video footage. You can see this from the footage. Even Hamas released footage of them firing the rockets. In other cases, for instance, where short-range rockets are fired at Israeli forces, you'll hear people cheering, for instance, that the rockets are coming out, because of course these are people that have been displaced and they're seeing rockets fly at the enemy. So this is a good indicator of how close people are. In these videos, you couldn't hear people cheering for it. You couldn't hear any people in the background. And on top of that as well, they're saying, I think it's a little bit less than this, but they're saying of the 1.4 million people who were in Rafah, that approximately 1 million of them have moved into these UN designated safe zone areas. And so there is literally no need for them to fire from a densely populated civilian area. And also, if that was true, why wouldn't they just fire on the location where they came from? They did not come from the sort of central area to the west of Rafah, the west side of Rafah in the south. These rockets were not fired from where these civilians were in tents. So the justification there is just ridiculous. And of course, as well, no Israelis were killed by these rockets. So that's another thing as well. And if they wanted to go after that specific site, they would have tracked it. So the Israelis know exactly where it is. They could have shown us where it is. If they were so convinced that it came from a civilian area, amongst civilians, for instance, sheltering in tents or something like this, they could have shown us, because they have all of their drones in the sky. They have everything to monitor. They could geolocate where it came from. But they don't release that footage, and they don't release that imagery because they know that it didn't come from amongst a densely populated civilian area. There's literally no need for them to do it. And also, these people, that are fighting as part of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and the PFLP, DFLP, Fatah, and all the other armed movements there in the Gaza Strip, their families are there in Rafah. Their families are in the UN designated areas. So these people, they don't want to bring fire and have them, the Israelis, kill their own family members. It makes no sense. But this is, an excuse that they use all of the time. Well, why doesn't Hamas always fire from, you know, the most open areas. Number one, the Israelis are in most of the fully open areas now, in Gaza, where there's not, you know, either population centers that were there before, or these are urban areas. Gaza is one of the most densely populated areas on Earth, and so they have to fire from strategic locations in order to actually hit the enemy without being blown to pieces. And that's the nature of the warfare there. But you could spin that back on the Israelis. Why are the Israelis occupying people's homes and firing from their buildings? Why are the Israelis using civilians as human shields, like we saw evidence of them doing, video evidence of them doing in multiple areas, but also evidence which came out from multiple human rights organizations surrounding their invasion of Shifa Hospital? Why are they doing that? Why are they acting and behaving in this way if they hate human shield taking and firing from civilian areas, as they claim Hamas does so much?
Right. And I think that there's a recent example that just went around from Rafah, where they were caught yet again. I don't know if you saw that, a newer one where they were caught using human shields. I mean, and this is, I think I've seen at least 4 or 5 examples since October 7th. And this isn't even getting into the neighbor procedure and the verifiable reality of them using human shields, but that they've done this publicly right in front of everybody. You know, it's just this infuriating dynamic. But to go back to your point, which I think is very important there, is the location. What you're saying is that the location that they showed, which is easy to identify based on the image, where you can see the lines, the smoke lines, and, you know, the general area, which again they said was from in between 2 controlled IDF locations, which I think we can verify, was not the location they then bombed. And we understand, we now know they fired at least 60 times in 48 hours, 1-ton bomb level stuff we're talking about, right? So we're talking about the massive bombing for 2 people, they claim. I mean, simple math shows you that they either didn't know where they were or they weren't there in general, indiscriminate. But to the point that I think is important, if you make if we now know they didn't bomb the location it came from, what we do know, and this is being disputed, despite on my last show, I went over the information that they posted showing, and the leaflets they dropped, showing that it was locations 2371 where they said they were supposed to go, which was the location that they then pointed to later. That's Al-Mawasi generally, where they said that that's where they bombed. So it's undeniable that they told them to go there, not months ago, but the days before they then bombed this location. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that was an engineered plan in your opinion, or was that sort of a opportunistic action taken to maximize pain and suffering? I mean, what do you think this was?
I think it was more of a, you know, they seized the moment. They know that civilians are there and they targeted it. And so I think this is the thing. They're using all these AI technology systems, right, to generate targets. And so they can use this system basically as their get out of jail free card to say, well, this system generated a target for us and said there's a 50% chance there's a guy who was, you know, part of Hamas or is part of Hamas at some point, or is affiliated to them in this area. And then they could go, well, there you go. That's our target. That's in a densely civilian area. It's densely populated by civilians' intent. But we're doing this specifically to send a message to them. If you think that you can fire rockets at Tel Aviv, we're going to decapitate your babies and blow up your civilians. I don't know if they specifically aim to decapitate a baby, but definitely to burn bodies to pieces, to a crisp, like they did. They knew those weapons were capable of doing what they were, and they fired them. And so when the Israelis designate these so-called safe areas and these safe zones, we've seen throughout the war, and this is why the United Nations came out at the start and said there are no such thing as safe zones and safe areas, and this has never worked in other conflicts which we've dealt with. So the Israelis can't claim to do this. They said, go south, go to these safe areas in the south. And that's why you had 1.4 million people congregated in Rafah, you know?
Right.
So all these people went down there. They bombed them on the way. Some of them came back and retreated, and they bombed them on the way back. They bombed them in their safe areas and their safe zones. They bomb anything. They've hit every single hospital in Gaza, has either partially or completely been destroyed and affected in dramatic ways, or invaded by the Israelis. And so they'll hit everything and anything. And a lot of it is just knee-jerk reaction stuff. Okay, some of our troops died here and were ambushed. Oh, okay, our special forces unit failed to recapture some of the prisoners in Hamas detention, okay, we'll bomb civilians in here to teach them a lesson. That seems to be what this is. Instead of the most calculated, they know where these zones are. They know where the areas are. They know they've constantly got drones monitoring. They know where everything is. So they don't need to even think, okay, we'll congregate people here now, and then in 2 weeks we'll bomb them in this location. They don't even need to think like that. I think they're reacting on the go. For instance, the very invasion of Rafah itself was at a pivotal point. Hamas agreed to a ceasefire proposal, which was almost identical to the much praised ceasefire proposal of Antony Blinken. The CIA and the Mossad, they worked together to put this proposal together and send it through to Hamas. Hamas, by the admission of unnamed U.S. officials in the U.S. media, the U.S. officials said that this is basically the same plan. This is the same proposal that we gave to them. There's only small little things that have been amended by Hamas. And of course, Netanyahu, the week prior, for an entire week prior, was talking about, we can't do a deal with Hamas without defeating Hamas, which makes no sense. And we cannot stop the Rafah invasion. And so when this came, they thought, the Israelis saw this and thought, okay, they've pulled our bluff here. And I think they expected Hamas not to accept it. And so after they called their bluff, the United States was then going to pressure them to take the deal, because this is the deal which the US put together with Israeli intelligence. And Israel immediately sent its forces belonging to the Jivati Brigade into areas of Rafah, and then the 401st Battalion into the Rafah crossing to seize it from Palestinian control on the Gaza side with Egypt. This was a violation of the Camp David agreement between the Egyptians and the Israelis. This essentially destroys that peace agreement. Essentially, what this does is it gives the Egyptians the ability, now that they're in the Philadelphia corridor and they've seized that border crossing. And also yesterday, they shot dead an Egyptian soldier to actually go to war with Israel. Now, the Egyptian regime, we all know, is not going to do that, but technically they could. And what we saw with that knee-jerk reaction to send them in there and then start invading Rafah is that they're reacting on the go to what's happening. For instance, you mentioned the ICJ provisional ruling, which was issued, and it was very strong language. They came out and they said, Israel needs to halt its invasion of Rafah. And also it said, we feel the need, and I'm paraphrasing, but in that document, if you read it, they also said underneath that, they said, we feel the need to restate that Israel must follow the original provisional measures. Also, it must implement what we have told it to do. Because obviously, and now this is me reading in between the lines, but they put it there for a reason. It's them saying, Israel is not abiding by any of these original provisional measures which we issued against them to try and restrain them. So we feel the need to tell them again to do what we told them to do back in January. The Israelis reacted by upping their bombing campaign in Rafah. That's what they did. And also, when they invaded Rafah, they decided to invade Jabalia and Jabalia refugee camp, which was a massive strategic mistake for them, because the Palestinian resistance changed their strategy. They started to hit the Israelis coming head on, and they started to inflict massive casualties. It's actually the worst battle for the Israelis in terms of casualties they've suffered, according to the estimates which are put out. They fought in the entire war. And this is an area where they said they destroyed all the Hamas battalions since they defeated the Palestinian resistance fighters. But they're all still there. They haven't even defeated even the smaller groups of the 11 groups that are operating and functional in the Gaza Strip now. And so that invasion was just a ridiculous propaganda move. They went, well, we know locations where we bombed, and we think we killed our own hostages, so we're going to go retrieve some of their bodies. And so
did they say that?
Invade. That's what they've been doing in Jabalia. Yeah. Or they didn't say that the locations they bombed they went into, but they know that these are the locations they bombed, and that their people are that their people are dead there. So they've been covering their bodies, and that's what they've gone in there to do, because they haven't captured any of these. You know, they've taken, I think, 6 bodies out of Jabalia, of their captives, and they're all dead. And
what do you think the likelihood is that they killed them with their own bombing campaign?
Almost 100%. Some of them, for instance, there's the case of that that German woman,
Shani Luke.
Yeah, there's her. I think there's reasonable evidence to suggest that she was killed beforehand, or she died of her injuries. We heard reports that she was alive when she was taken into Gaza, but later then we heard that she had been killed. But in the case of others, we've been told, not only were they killed, but the Hamas members and the Islamic Jihad members who were guarding these prisoners, they were killed as well in the communiques which were released. And the Israelis know these areas. That's how they know where to go into. It's because they know the areas where they bombed. They have this, it's all registered there, that they know where this is. And so they've been sending in, obviously special forces units to go and take these bodies out. And then in one case, which happened not too long ago over the weekend, the Palestinians ambushed one of these forces and managed to capture more soldiers. They didn't say the precise number of soldiers. They said they fell between the injured, dead, and captured as 3 categories, which they put out. So a dramatic failure, but they decided, why invade Jabalia? They could have got all of the bodies and all of the alive prisoners in a deal.
Exactly.
The non-combatants, on October 8th, the Hamas movement offered the Israelis to hand them over all of the non-combatants, because of course they're in a different category than the soldiers that they captured. The non-combatants, they'd hand them all over in exchange for Israel not invading Gaza. They said that on October 8th, and Israel just ignored it. And Israel has been bombing and killing its own prisoners. And then it goes into areas like Jabalia, blows everything up in sight, and gets met with the toughest resistance yet. And then it turns around and it goes, oh, well, yeah, it seems like Hamas have reformed. It's like, no, you never destroyed them.
Right. Let me ask you this. In regard to the non-combatants, especially the children such as the Bibas family, which, as we've reported, it even CBS was forced to admit they were killed by IDF bombings. Their father is in a video claiming that. The point is that, in your opinion, and maybe even you have some insight into some statements made by Hamas that we haven't seen, that what is their logic that they felt they were targets, or was this an accidental? My point is that if they're saying the next day, here, we'll give them back for this, do you think that was a level of tactical mistake? Was there people that took the wrong people not knowing, or was the argument that they were all valid targets? And in your assessment of the situation?
Well, obviously I don't have any insider knowledge on those who were there and who themselves participated in the attack on October 7th. So without talking to them and confirming from them, or at least hearing them out, and knowing their interactions with those who were seized, I couldn't know exactly what happened in each and every single individual case. However, what I'll say is that clearly from Hamas, its statements, what we've seen said by the leadership, it put out as well its own dossier on October 7 as well, to try and demonstrate what the goals of the operation were and what was actually committed, and to respond to a lot of the Israeli propaganda, like we heard the 40 beheaded babies and the mass pre-planned rape campaign, for instance, stuff like this, which there's no evidence for. And so when we look at that, I think that Hamas, from the evidence that we have, and the other Palestinian armed factions on October 7 were surprised by how easy it was. Honestly, I think they thought that the majority of their fighters were going to die upon penetrating that fence. I don't think they knew exactly how simple it was going to be to dismantle the Israeli sovereign command of the Israeli military. and how easy it was for them to penetrate into the bordering settlements. It was very easy for them to do. Then what the Israelis did in response was another unprecedented occurrence. They decided to fire indiscriminately, as demonstrated by Al Jazeera, on their own civilians, whether they be locked up in their own homes or they're being transported across the separation fence into the Gaza Strip. In this circumstance, and I've spoken to a number of international lawyers on it, and of course you're right in saying that it is a crime to take civilians captive. You cannot take a hostage. That's a crime. That's a war crime. It's a violation of international law. What I would say on that front is there are a number of ways to break that down, which I don't believe have been spoken about anywhere else. Number one is there were clearly cases that we see from the documented evidence of Hamas taking people in fear of what may happen. They were they were in disarray. For instance, we saw in some cases, they literally let an Israeli woman go back with her child over to the Israeli side. There were other instances where they seized them and brought them in and they were under fire. So we don't know exactly the reason they took every single person that they took. However, that wouldn't be to say, well, now Robert Inlakesh is saying that Hamas took all of these Israeli non-combatants simply because they wanted to safeguard their lives from the Israeli Apache helicopters and drone strikes. In some of those cases, I'm saying it's plausible, and there appears to be evidence of that in some cases. Then on top of that as well, you have to understand the additional element that it wasn't just Hamas. Hamas sent first its best forces in, the Nukhba forces. These forces are the special forces. And for anybody that knows anything basic about military strategy, if you want to conduct a clean operation, you will send your most loyal forces because there's less chance of them committing heinous crimes when they go over. However, when Hamas penetrated and they saw it was so easy to dismantle the Israeli military, and the other armed groups saw the exact same thing, the other groups flooded over. So now you have involved many of the other 10 Palestinian armed groups who didn't know this was going to happen. Also, you have other Hamas members who weren't very well briefed on specific missions who were sent over. Then you had Palestinians, ordinary Palestinians, who saw, for instance, the wall being pulled down and these Israelis being ripped out of the tents, and they charged themselves. And some of these people were people who lost relatives, people that for themselves, and grabbed their own firearms and came over. So in that situation, so many people were captured from the settlements, from surrounding areas. So many people were shot. There were so many different firefights that the situation was so incredibly complicated that I think Hamas completely lost control of what happened. So that's not for me to say, well, that absolves them of any responsibility for what occurred. However, that is the context. That is the reality. Anyone that looks at it objectively, and I've seen every single video that is available from October 7. I've looked at all of them. I've seen everything. I've seen, the shooting of non-combatants, and I've seen them, for instance, the Hamas members, they released a video of them, feeding Israeli babies, for instance, and, pushing them in their cots, right? I've seen a massive array and mixture of videos which came out from that day, which shows the chaos of what actually happened. So for me to say, did Hamas plan to take all these non-combatants? I don't know how many people they were planning to take in terms of non-combatants. I do know that the strategy definitely was to take a large chunk of them, Israelis in general, in order to exchange them for Palestinian prisoners who are kept, and there were around 5,000 at that time. There's about 10,000 now. So that was the reasoning. Regardless, if you take a non-combatant, as long as there's not a reasonable, there's not a justifiable reason for you taking that non-combatant. For instance, a situation where maybe an Apache helicopter was firing and they grabbed a kid and a mother and they put them on a quad bike and sped across into Gaza, for instance. that situation, maybe there would be some sort of legal argument you could make. However, taking non-combatants is a crime under international law. There's no question about it. It's a crime on the Israeli side, and it's a crime on the Palestinian side. And the laws of war apply to armed groups and states alike, and they don't differentiate. These are all the same crimes. Maybe you could argue that because of the situation of the fighters and the Palestinians, that, you know, you could ease charges against people, but that might not even work as an argument. And this is what I've heard from international lawyers when I've asked the question as well. So it is a bit of a complicated situation, as a long-winded answer to your question.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I mean, what's interesting about it is adding some, like, of course, the lens put over this by people that want to make this one-sided and dehumanize anybody that's on the other side of it is to say, you know, Hamas is a terrorist organization. They're all evil, angry, you know, like whatever. And that's just not the case. Even if we're talking about an actual terrorist organization, the point is that it's not as one-sided as people try to make these things out to be. These are human beings, and they have their own opinions. And so the point is, clearly, you could make an argument that, as you're saying, and as I've covered before, whatever we want to, and again, you and I should really have a long conversation just about 2006 and the election and what that really was and whether it was legitimate. But the idea that from that point forward, you've had generations of people that have had their families taken, that look to something like this, whether you think legitimate or not, and join this to change for their own interests. And you can see over decades that might have changed the outcome of what this entity really is, right? And so now you've got people that are in there all of a sudden who do feel differently about whether they should be attacking women and children because they have a personal feeling from that. And you could argue it plausibly that some of them might have tried to do that now that we know for a fact, admitted by the security heads of the kibbutz be'eri, tank drivers, helicopter pilots, that they did fire on innocent people, their own people. So that's something you could at least add as a possibility. I think that's very interesting. But to go back to the other point about, you know, whether or not these people were legally taken, I think my point has always been to focus on the infants, the children, because and look, if you're going to make a fine line, which I think we should, and what you can prove, yes, non-combatants, that is the crime, but there's a very fuzzy line when it comes to Israel about who is a non-combatant, when it comes to armed settlers, you know, police, and these different overlaps around this. So that's why I think you can prove that the child aspect of it is a crime. I don't think anybody can dispute that unless you argue that that's why they took them, which would be very hard to prove. But so that's why it comes back to why I asked. It's like on the next very day, from a leadership position, they said, let's get this done. Let's get them back. I think that's indicative of the fact that the plan was not to do that. That would be my assumption, my opinion. You guys can take it for what you will. And I think that, to your point, it explains, you know, that they lost control, individuals. And if my other point would just be to say, if you take any grouping of people in the world, doesn't matter what you think they believe, where they're from, how honest you think they are, and you put that whole group in a situation where nobody's accountable in that moment, some of them will break the law. Some of them will do terrible things. You know, so whether you think it's about they're the Palestinian or whether, you know, that's what a lot of them want to make it out to be. See, that's indicative of what the population is like. That's ridiculous. I think that you have a situation where people chose to break the law, and many others did not. You know, so all that to be said, I think this is very eye-opening for some people to think about the different dynamics and not to just broadly say it's all one thing or all bad people. You know, that's what kills me about all this. To go back to one of the points that you made earlier that I don't want to miss on this is the artificial intelligence side of this, right? So I think it's really interesting. And to bring up what you highlighted again, and what I brought up a second ago was the Plus 972 magazine article about lavender, which is different than the one they covered about Habsora, which was before that. There was the more broad building aimed, you know, algorithm, if you will. And this is the one that's about people and the, you know, using the, you know, what phone calls they made and what buildings they shop in to basically target these people individually. And so this is very important. People understand that he's right, that they're using artificial intelligence. And this, I think, is an important point that has not been discussed enough. And tell me if you've already seen this being argued, that I do believe they're going to start to use this day. Well, it wasn't our fault. We just followed what the AI said, right? So I completely agree with you. First, have you seen examples of that argument being made? And before you answer, I just want to show you a part that they spoke to IDF members about this on the record. According to these sources, the army's decided, it says in the first weeks of the war, that for every junior Hamas operative, that it was permissible to kill 15 to 20 civilians. That's just crazy to me. And over 100 if they're a high-ranking one. And this, remember, this is people that they go, oh, they were on the phone chat group with this one person, so therefore they're a junior Hamas member. It's just disgusting to me. So have you heard that excuse? And you can give me your thoughts on that.
I've heard that in Israeli media, in the Israeli Hebrew media. And we'll see, for instance, that is a discussion. Well, you know, sometimes these systems are wrong, and so there's the mistakes are made. I've heard that. I'll see, for instance, on Telegram groups updates from the Hebrew media, and to see what they're saying essentially, and you can translate it, read it for yourself, and that's a great thing about Telegram. We get our own window into the Israeli media, these very evil and demented Telegram groups from the Israeli side, where they're making fun of beheaded babies, for instance.
72 Virgins, I believe, was the name of the one that got publicized. That's a verifiable fact for those listening. Go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. And so we get our window into that. And so it does seem that argument is being employed. The other argument that's being employed, because of course, like you noted in this article, about this article, this system is being used, and they're giving this, proportion of, how many civilians to Hamas operatives ratio that will be acceptable. But also in that article, it says that it takes 20 seconds on average, 20 seconds of a human being looking at that target, which means essentially the majority of them, they find it and they order it, find it, order it, find it. And then there might be another one which they ponder over for a minute. They might look at it for a minute and go, maybe. And that's where you come out with that average of 20 seconds. So essentially, most of those targets, they wouldn't have looked at them at all. Because if you're getting an average of about 20 seconds, you've got to assume that on one of those targets, there's got to be one Israeli. It couldn't have been 20 seconds, 20 seconds, 20 seconds. There had to be a bit of variability. So some of them had to have been dramatically lower. And some of them maybe a few minutes long, where they've had a conversation about it and gone, yeah, okay. We'll order this. Sorry, go ahead.
I just want to add one quick point to this, which is important, and I'm glad you brought this up. From the other article, it's about Habsora, or translates to the gospel, which is the one more aimed at buildings and locations. It was very clearly stated in that they were being driven for maximum use, right? So they were their leadership behind them going, hurry up. Like, you need to make, driving them to not have to evaluate, but just accept what they were saying. And they made this very clear. And so if you're talking about this dynamic here, where they're going, we have 20 seconds to make these decisions, that's the average. They're being pressured to lean into it. I think that's designed to make it the case where you're not even looking. You're just hitting the button based on what the computer said. Then you can go, well, I'm not the one that made the decision. I think that's actually being manufactured. I think that's a conscious choice to make that the outcome. And even giving them the variance, like we're highlighting, that you can kill 100 people. Let's not forget the Jabalia refugee camp the first time. Remember, Wolf Blitzer couldn't even swallow this when they told him on the show that they killed 200 people to go after one Hamas leader, which, as I understand it, wasn't even there as this all goes forward. And so we're proving all this stuff in real time. It's mind-blowing to me.
So this is it. And that's, sorry, to finish on that point that you asked me about before, in terms of them trying to make this an argument for them to give them plausible deniability. Well, the system was wrong. Another argument that they're now making, and was made in Haaretz, Israel's most reputable newspaper, not its most read, but its most reputable newspaper, is that the Israeli army is essentially, the high command is asleep at the wheel, and it's just woken up to the fact that the Israeli, many of units in the Israeli military they've lost control of them, and they've gone rogue. And so that's how they're trying to explain away why you see all these videos, for instance, of Israeli soldiers making genocidal statements, which are referenced in the International Court of Justice, or wearing women's underwear, or picking up photos of women and calling them horrible names and talking about them, who are most likely dead. You've occupied their home, or defecating over the floors on people's homes, or blowing up houses and buildings and universities for fun, for TikTok videos, and driving tanks over areas as an insult. All of these sort of things, that's explainable by we've lost control of them now. So they are starting to make these arguments. Oh, well, the AI technology, that's the problem. It's not the fact that we looked at it for 20 seconds on average before we ordered a kill strike, which massacred a whole group of civilians in their home or in tents. It's not our fault that our soldiers are making genocidal statements, which, of course, the leadership are making as well, then are, filming themselves committing war crimes on camera and using human shields and doing all sorts of horrible things with prisoners and all of this because we've lost control of them and the high command is asleep at the wheel. So these sort of arguments are consistently made.
Do you think that that's some of both? Because I find that fascinating, because I see your point and I agree that it's easy to go, well, they're doing their own thing. It's not indicative of the fact that we want this and that you can't blame the government for it. But I also think there's a level of that actually happening where you actually, because I think that we're watching these people that have, the common discussion point where you're watching occupation forces that have just spent the last however many decades enforcing on women and children, and they have no real understanding of what it's like to go to war like this or any ability to, and they're not real, functional. They're not, their bottom line is we're watching their, what's the right word for it? That they're just not under the real control of the outcome of what they're able to do. They're not disciplined is the right word I'm looking for, right? And so you can see that it's logical that they would have that kind of happen. But at the same time, they're kind of like, whatever, because we think the same thing. We hate these people. But then you get to a point like now where they're standing up making videos about how we're only going to follow this person and we're going to revolt against that side. So I think it's kind of a mixed bag. Would you agree with that? And to which way do you think it's slanting?
I think it's a controlled chaos, and it's been that way for years. This is the argument that I would make about that is you're very right. And for years, the Israeli military has suffered with getting its soldiers to actually follow order. But in this campaign, as we can establish as well, or perhaps we'll have a further, we'll talk further about this. This is a genocidal campaign. And so you're sending these people in with the message from the leadership about Amalek, don't even leave livestock alive, kill everyone, women and children, wipe them all out. And you're sending these people in, as we've seen various reports in the Hebrew media talking about it. Many soldiers refused to go to Gaza because they weren't well trained enough. They took them halfway through training and just threw them into Gaza, right? So a lot of these people are not well trained enough, not disciplined. There's so many reports in the Hebrew media that not just came out during this war, but before that, years and years before it, talking about the lack of discipline, the fact that soldiers are distracted, the fact that they're always on their phones, the fact that even they're receiving orders on WhatsApp from, their superiors, all of this, that it's completely dysfunctional. But in the midst of this, they've been testing new weapons technology on Palestinians for years. Yeah. They've formed new units like the Desert Frontier. Last year, that was revealed again by 972 Mag. And that is a settler unit specifically formed of these people who came from what's known as the Hilltop Youth, who were considered by the Israelis for some time to be terrorists, because they were attacking even Israeli soldiers. That's how insane these people are. And they made a specialized unit for them to operate in the West Bank. So when they say, well, we've lost control, there is an element of that. But also when you have an armed force where essentially it's built on the back of supremacy, ethnic supremacy, the leaders are referencing genocidal, they're using biblical references to essentially tell their people to go and commit genocide. When you give them the ability to kill so many civilians to combatant, and you don't even need to really justify it so frequently. When in the past conflicts, the last time that an Israeli soldier was actually, two of them were tried for using human shields, for instance, those two soldiers, that was in 2010 for human shield, a child that they took as a human shield in Gaza in 2008-9. They received less prison time for taking in that 2008-9 war a Palestinian child as a literal human shield, less prison time their sentences were than an Israeli soldier that stole a credit card in Gaza. The message, and since then they've used human shields in Gaza in their incursions. They've used them again, but there's been no and they use them in the West Bank as well. They haven't prosecuted any since 2010. There's been no punishment for human shield taking. By the way, human shield taking used to be they had the neighbor procedure in the Israeli military. So it used to be enshrined in military doctrine that you take Palestinians as human shields until they abolished it in the early 2000s because of a few high profile cases. The Supreme Court threw it out. It's supposed to be illegal.
But according to the UN documents, the neighbor procedure was the follow-up. That they actually stopped the procedure, then began using what they call the neighbor procedure. And as far as I can tell, that's still technically the standing policy. Like, unless that's been, so either way, the point is we can clearly document that they have continued to use these, like on the record, like even the policy itself, but just in front of us walking around with people in blindfolds. There's been 2 examples in the last couple of months that I've seen. One, which was even picked up by corporate media, where they highlighted the fact that the guy, because what happened was the guy was used, then was let go, and he went and talked to the media. And he was like, this is what just happened to me. And there was video proving it. So either way, it's obvious this continues to happen, which is just abhorrent, as they're screaming about inhuman shields, which I can yet to see any evidence of. At least, like, my point's been the same. It wouldn't surprise me that Hamas would be capable of doing that, or any group for that matter, that might justify that in the context of war. But we have yet to see that evidence. And even the things they claim, both of which I've now seen, one was Al Jazeera, one was even BBC, that broke down that they were lying. Proving that the video with the claim was from a hospital, turned out it was from the building, the area next to that. They weren't even cleared. They were lying. The idea was to prove that. It's amazing to me that continues.
Well, in terms of the human shields, it's been investigated time and time again by human rights organizations and the United Nations, and all concluded that there is not a single case of Hamas using a Palestinian as a human shield. So what Israel then does is it goes and it changes the definition of taking a human shield. It goes, well, because they fire from next to a civilian area, basically they're using those buildings as, and the people in them as human shields, which is not human shield taking. That's firing from a civilian area. They're 2 distinctly different things. But they make that argument because they know they can't make the argument. And also, the thing is, Hamas, if there was one video proving they used any Palestinian as a human shield, that would be enough for their destruction. I mark my words. After the war, if people saw in Gaza, they saw their kids and civilians being used by Hamas fighters as human shields, they would actually overthrow them. I'm confident.
Yeah.
I'm confident on that. There is no way. Now, in Gaza, for instance, the Palestinian population supports en masse, especially during times of war, their armed resistance. They support them. However, in the Gaza Strip, a lot of people are very heavily critical of Hamas for a variety of reasons. A lot of people despised Hamas for a lot of reasons, whether economic reasons or things they've heard on the media, which, some of which are true. There's gossipy stuff. Then there's, for instance, people who are actually taken by Hamas and like beaten and imprisoned. And there's all sorts of different reasons where people, and a lot of this is from the time of the Palestinian civil war, as it's called, between Fatah and Hamas, when Hamas first took control. A lot of the worst things happened during those times. And so people have a lot of resentment in Gaza towards Hamas, at least the political side of Hamas and political wing of Hamas and those activists and what that represents. If they saw that the fighters were taking human shields, it would be over for them. That's how you would actually destroy Hamas. But Hamas would never take them. Look, now this is me just like, I'm just based upon what I know. Based upon what I know. And also you can look at the historical record debunking that they've ever taken. They will not take human shields. They will not take human shields. And I say that pretty confidently. Now, this is just me giving an analysis. Like you may say, well, he's biased. Taking human shields is a death sentence to your resistance movement. Your people won't support you anymore. There's no way the people will stand up strong, and they will say, we're willing to die. If the Israelis strike our house, that's okay. We'll die because we're going to stay here on our land and we support our resistance. And you will hear that every day coming out of the Gaza Strip. People will lose their relatives and they'll get in the camera and they'll start pointing and they'll say, we support the resistance. We support them fighting back the Israelis. We're going to win, blah, blah, blah. That's not to undermine what they're saying at all, because of course, it's very heartfelt and important. But they'll say stuff like that. But that their children would be used by fighters as human shields? No way. No way. I don't believe it. Now, that's me. You may say to me, well, no people are beyond committing those sort of crimes. And I agree with you. Maybe there could be cases of something like that happening, but I don't believe that would happen. I think they know intrinsically not to do that.
Well, I would say clearly to the audience and myself especially that your opinion and your research has a lot of weight to this conversation. So that alone is, I think, important and impactful for people watching. But my point is the same. And your researched and educated opinion on this is just another aspect, is that we can turn around and go, and on top of that, there's not any evidence to back it up. It's like that, I think, is the point that needs to weigh on people, is just because Israel keeps yelling these things. By the way, they also told us Iran would have 45 nuclear weapons every day for the last, that doesn't happen either. They've lied about a lot. I think that's one of the things that most people have really come to understand, even if they support them, is that they've lied verifiably about a hell of a lot that they still maintain, about the lies they still maintain. And I think that's one of the most important parts. And I've been really trying to drill this home. We keep getting told that every act of bombing that takes a civilian life is human shields, human shields, human shields. Well, it's a little bit ridiculous that we keep seeing the shield element, but where's the human part of it? If we're to be told that they keep bombing them with human shield, where are the human part? Where are the Hamas elements that you keep telling us are being shielded by these dead bodies? We're fine. They don't exist. They're not there. Not once. Not a single example. I mean, that nobody honestly can believe that. That if they had the evidence, they would be waving it in front of our faces nonstop. It's just not the reality. So with what you added, I think it's a very interesting thing that I think people will consider. And the evidence enough is enough to do that. So I'd like to go of two quick things in general, and then I want to just kind of end on a couple of points. We can talk about Iran and the overlap there in Lebanon. Is that you posted some important articles recently, The Last American Vagabond, for example, the shocking origins of the debunked claim that the UN revised Gaza death toll, talking about lies, for that matter, that this is exactly what you're breaking down, the egregious lies that are on the surface laughably false, or any number of the things they've shown us about what they claim they find in Gaza, or here's a book cover from Amazon they claim is some kind of a book, all the lies they put out, or the instructions for raping, these things they keep lying about. This one was a big one. Israel's newest mistranslated Hamas hostage video debunked. In general sense, just comment for me on the propaganda, whether it's historically or some specific examples, and what your thoughts are on how this is going. And I guess my specific question is, how is it that it's this bad? Has it always been this bad, or what do you think is happening that it's this see-through ridiculousness they keep putting out?
It's always been similar, and it's always been, to some degree, just as bad. I mean, for instance, you'll hear the propaganda about the human shields. There's no evidence of Palestinian fighters taking human shields, but there are mountains and mountains of evidence that you can uncover for yourselves if you go online and look at it, of Israelis taking human shields and having that enshrined in their military doctrine anyway. Rape, mass rape, that's this time. And I'd say this is where it's got worse, in my opinion, is these new claims of rape, which we see. Now, is it possible that there were people raped on October 7? It's always possible. I wouldn't rule it out and say that didn't happen. However, there are no victims. There are no victims. They say because they're all dead, conveniently enough. There's no evidence. Now, evidence, in my opinion, is not saying that this body, which has blood here, suggests this. I mean, you could say that it is evidence. I could extrapolate from that. Well, maybe if she was bent this way and that, or whatever. And you're having to use your imagination to conjure up anything, right? So you've seen images of people, dead, women dead, women with blood in certain areas or whatever. In some cases that they've literally, defecated on themselves. And then that's used and held up as evidence. But the United Nations was let in to inspect these sites, to find, the evidence, not to inspect it, not to conduct an investigation. But in some of these instances, the United Nations themselves, you pulled it up here, that Pramila Patten was the one who announced it. If you go and read that report, you'll see that in some cases, I can't remember which kibbutz now it was, but in one kibbutz, they said it was clear that the bodies had been manipulated.
Right.
The bodies of the dead had been manipulated, and the crime scene was distorted, and therefore that allegation of rape was incorrect. It wasn't plausible because that from that UN, which is supposed to be Israel's, evidence that they were going to hold up to the world. Look, and they said it's plausible in that report. They said it's plausible. The conclusion, if you look at the entire report, there's nothing in there that you can read and go, yeah, that looks like it's, reasonably that makes sense. There's a strong argument here that, there was a mass rape campaign. But down the bottom in the conclusion, they say, well, there are some things that indicate perhaps that rapes could have happened, and it's plausible, essentially, they say. But that's not investigation. That's just them collecting evidence.
Yeah.
So
right. That was the point.
And we look at all of that evidence, look at all of it. Did we see a mass rape campaign occur there? No. Have we seen one proven case of rape on October 7? No, not a single case.
Right.
So like, I cannot say that there wasn't a single case because I just do not know. There may have been. There may have been. I have no idea how it happened or where it happened. I don't know. But there may have been. I'm not going to say it didn't at all.
It's possible is the point, which I agree with.
It's possible. Everything is possible. For instance, if we didn't have any evidence yet in that time, when the 40 beheaded babies story came out, they were still collecting evidence, from the scenes of the attack. And at that point, that's why it was plausible the 40 babies were beheaded, because at that time, we could say, well, we didn't collect all the evidence. Maybe someone did see 40 beheaded babies, right? And that's why they repeated it. But then later on, the evidence came out and it was clear that, there were no beheaded babies. Not a single baby was beheaded, despite Joe Biden saying there was, confirmed images of him, of terrorists beheading babies. In this case, I am convinced, in this case, whether there was a rape that happened or not, we don't have any proof of it.
Mm-hmm.
Possible that some could have happened. There was no mass rape campaign. There was no premeditated mass rape campaign. There's zero evidence of a premeditated rape campaign. Israel has consistently mistranslated video after video after video, and the recent one as well that we've seen, to try and make it look like Hamas fighters are talking, sexually and talking about taking sex slaves and all sorts of nonsense. And they've mistranslated these videos. And you can go to Reuters and the Associated Press and all of the fact-finding organizations that you want to go and confirm that this is not just me saying this. These are mistranslations, right? And they've done this, and every single time Israel gets in trouble, right, for something horrible that it does, again, we hear more about this mass rape campaign and more about, a new report from New York Times. Are the prisoners being raped in Hamas tunnels and rape? Because the beheaded babies thing, that was all to, conjure up these images of savages. And then again, this is Hamas are mass rapists. They did a mass rape campaign against the beautiful, pure Jewish Israelis. And that's what it is. It's very, very, very racist. That is what it is at its core. And you have to do that, because if you're going to justify genocide, you have to demonize that entire group of people. They have to be deserving of genocide, because they elected this group, Hamas, that rapes women. And, if you're going to believe Rabbi Shmuley, they cut off the breasts of the woman and they were throwing it and juggling it in between each other, and they're there beheading babies, and they put the babies' heads on clothing lines, and and they used magical space pigs with rainbows flying out their asses to decapitate innocent women. Anything, they just say anything. Hitler, chemical weapons, Al-Qaeda, Daesh, anything. They just throw anything, because they just want you to think of the Palestinians as savages, and the Palestinian movement, Hamas, as a group of savages who are just thirsty for Jewish blood. And that's why, as well, Joe Biden, he said about Hamas that they're driven by ancient desire to kill the Jews. This is racist language. It's racist language. That's what it is. It's Orientalist language that has been manufactured. And they do the same thing before every single war. Every group that they want to kill. These people are this, and this, and their group that represents them and their armed group or their government or whatever are doing this, and this. They use the same thing for Gaddafi. Remember the whole thing with Gaddafi was giving his soldiers Viagra, and Hillary Clinton went out and, did her campaign for that. Like she did her campaign for the mass rapes campaign, Hamas mass rape campaign as well.
Or Russia, Ukraine, same game.
Same thing. They have to try and make them not human. And it's okay if you subject them to horrible forms of torture and you mass murder them and their civilians die, because we have to get rid of these savages. And ultimately, if you go, well, you're killing way too many civilians now, get rid of the savages, because most people will accept the propaganda. Yeah, get rid of the savages, but now you're killing too many uninvolved people. And then they go, and their last argument is, well, either they're being used as human shields, so what do we do? And if that doesn't work, they go back to they voted them in. So there's no innocence in Gaza. Look at this video of them celebrating the rockets coming out.
Right.
So you have to completely demonize a people. You have to make sure that it's acceptable to murder them. And that's what they've done. That's what the US president has done. That is what Western regimes have done. That's what the Israeli government has done. That is what the Israeli media and the Western mainstream media have also done. The New York Times is just as guilty of this in its reports that it's put out. For instance, UNRWA, and sorry, I'm going on a little bit of a tangent here. UNRWA, when the report about UNRWA came out that they were, there's Hamas affiliations to UNRWA, which were completely debunked. Israel released this dossier where? First to the New York Times. The New York Times took this dossier and started quoting and putting information and putting it all together. And they made, in their article, they made this dossier that Israel released to them seem plausible, like there was something there to it. It went to Channel 4 News. Channel 4 News immediately did a good investigative piece with it and said there was no evidence. There's none whatsoever. So how did the New York Times receive it and go, there's evidence of UNRWA connections to Hamas and terrorism, blah, 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 blah. And then on the other hand, Channel 4 News, and then later as well, US media got handed it and they all looked at it and they went, what? And so the US media, like we've pointed out, these stories which they perpetuate about the changing death toll and all of this, and Fox News were, sort of the torchbearer of that story. Others were involved, as you can check the article and read. But like, this is part of it. It's part of like this demonization. They're liars. They're using dolls. Even they have bots now. The Israelis have paid bots that go onto everyone's posts and say, that's a fake baby. That beheaded baby is a doll. Yeah, that was proven it's a doll. Just to try and sow doubt. These people are liars. These people are dirty. They're rapists. They're mutilators. They're savages. They're driven by ancient desires and all of this. This is the most clearly racist language, and it's coming from U.S. and other Western governments, which claim to be so anti-racist and would take the title of woke if you're to believe the conservative or Republican side. Oh, they're woke, and look at all their woke rhetoric. It's genocidal rhetoric.
Or just from a global perspective, as opposed to U.S. politics, the rules-based international order. It's hard to take that with a straight face as they're literally disregarding the ICJ and the ICC or lying about everything they put out. And to just add to what you were saying about the rape allegations, let's not forget that Pramila Patten, the main points, this is not an investigation. She said very clearly, we have not allotted blame to anyone. So how in the world can they claim this proves that this happened and Hamas was responsible? And that main point that were multiple claims were debunked in her investigation. Not that they were mistaken, that they lied. And this continues to this day. Even the Zaka guy, who seems to be the most fanatical of them all, continues to state these things. But most everybody else in most cases have recanted, have changed, have acknowledged that other people said that that didn't happen that way, that the statistics of the people that were there prove of most of their allegations could have even happened in the first place. 40 beheaded babies, 15 babies in a clothesline, all false. And even more so, one of the biggest ones that just came out was about, and this was stated by other people that were respondents that were there, that they admitted to moving one of those bodies, which I think was trying to cover, like, ultimately nothing should have been moved, right? If we were talking about a crime scene. But then they said as they moved her, her underwear came off. And this is what they then said, oops, we saw that, and then assumed that was rape. I mean, why would you assume that in an investigation? So in any way you spin this, they were moving things. They lied about what they saw. In some cases, others came through and said, no, that's not true. So there were some elements that seemed to be at least somewhat honest about it. And all this has been proving that they've been lying from day one about the core allegations of this. So why anybody would go forward believing the next allegation is beyond me.
Also, there's no coverage of when, for instance, back in February, 2 cases were confirmed, or they were reported by the United Nations, and they said they found that there was plausible evidence in this. Not only that there were threats of rape and threats of all sorts of sexual violence, but there were 2 cases of rape in Gaza that Israeli soldiers had raped 2 women.
Right.
So that is what the UN found. Okay, that's what they found. That they actually had accusers. They had allegations of rape. And the US media completely ignored it. There was nothing. There's been allegations of Palestinian women being raped in Israeli prisons. Nobody gave a damn about it. And on top of that, not too long, I think it was October or November, that an Israeli soldier, a male Israeli soldier, was arrested for raping a female Israeli soldier. So they're raping, like there's rape in their own armed forces.
Which is
wanted
a
to focus on.
prominent problem, by the way. You know, I've shown this before, where over the years it was like 30% of the people have been sexually assaulted and then a couple of years later, despite this big highlight, it was 60%. Well, clearly that's not working, whatever you think you're doing. Like, it just continues to be. I think that's an indicative of an internal problem. And like, this is what we're highlighting, this Zionist organization that is basically seeding hatred, bigotry. All the things that we're seeing are the opposite of what the rest of the West claims they're fighting for. And yet this is their chief ally. Like, all of this adds up to a very dishonest picture. And I think that's very important. I'd like to end with you about the conversation, just a little bit about foreign policy, about the overlap to this, where you recently wrote in regard to the other countries and how this just can be broadened out, let's say, to something more than just Israel and Gaza. And I think it's very clear that specifically the coalition leading out elements of it, like the Religious Zionism Party, have been outspoken. They want a regional conflict. They've said this many times, despite the Western media ignoring that. You've recently wrote the article about bad faith betrayals of the Iranian president and the overlap of that conversation of the helicopter and the suspiciousness of all that and happening. So just kind of an ending conversation, you know, where do you see this going with Iran, with Lebanon? You know, where do you think this will be drawn into something larger? You know, give me your thoughts on where this goes and other points you may want to include.
I believe that on the Lebanese front, yes. Iran, that's yet to be seen. There's a number of things being said about Iran, and there's a number of different ways it could go. However, I think that's it's less likely. Lebanon, I do believe there will be a war between Israel and Lebanon, whether it's a limited war or it's a massive war, which will bring in other regional actors. If there is a war between Hezbollah and the other forces in Lebanon as well, because Hezbollah is not the only one, it's obviously the most powerful force there. If there is a war that started between Hezbollah and Israel, we'll see unprecedented missile attacks on Israeli cities. And if Israel is going to try and do to Beirut what it did to Gaza City, for instance, then to Tel Aviv will be done what is done to Beirut. And that is what will happen. They have an equation like that with the missile strength to do what they want to do now. They've taken out all of the Israeli defenses. Basically, they're blind in the north. They've destroyed the Israeli industry, agriculture. They've displaced over 100,000 Israeli settlers from the north in the Galilee. There are protests going on against the Israeli government for not doing anything. The missiles and the drone strikes and all of these different experimental weapons that the Hezbollah are using to see how effective they are being used on a daily basis. Sometimes they'll do 15 operations a day, other times 10. Sometimes they'll draw them back the next day and then they'll hit back with another 13 the next day. And they have hit so many buildings. It's around 1,000 buildings now that have been partially or completely destroyed in those settlement areas. Military facilities and infrastructure there. It has been devastating to the Israelis, to their economy in the north. And I don't believe that they can take it for much longer. If they continue to do that, it's just out of pure fear of what Hezbollah will do back to them if they invade Lebanon or if they launch a massive attack on Lebanon, that they haven't done it. But I believe that it's getting to a boiling point where Israel will launch an offensive. If it does it, it has two different ways to do it. It's either the suicidal way to do it. You go straight over the Lebanese border and you try and invade that way. Like I said, it's a suicide mission. It's not going to work well for them. They're not going to make it very far. Or they would go in through Syrian territory and then come in and fire on Lebanon through Syrian territory. I think that's possible that they could do that. And it seems like Syria from this situation now could extract something from such a war, such as making sure that the Israelis at the end of it stop their airstrikes against Syrian territory, their illegal airstrikes against Syrian territory, and they could seize on that opportunity. And so Hezbollah is looking at this situation. Obviously, Hamas is still capable in Gaza. The one red line that Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Lebanese Hezbollah, drew early on in the conflict in October was that Hamas will win and we will not let them lose. That was his red line. But also, it's gotten to the point where the human catastrophe is so incredibly large. The invasion of Rafah is looming, and it would be favorable now, perhaps, for them to engage in a conflict with the Israelis. And the Israelis are in deep water, and they're in a lot of trouble. The problem, however, is Hezbollah, I think, wants Israel to start the conflict. This is my analysis of it. Hezbollah would like Israel to start the conflict, because if Israel starts it, I think there's an understanding from the Israelis that if they do something limited and they announce a military operation, and it's very clear that it's not going to be an all-out attack, perhaps Hezbollah can then respond to that limited attack, right? And not have to go to all-out war. But if Hezbollah attacks and it goes for the kill, it will go across the Lebanese border into the Galilee. It will seize that territory with no trouble. And then obviously the Israelis will blow up everything they can in Lebanon, and it will be a catastrophe. So I think the way to handle it is to allow the Israelis to attack and then to defend Lebanon, and try and keep it to a point where it's not all out, that they don't have to send their forces into northern occupied Palestine and to seize the Galilee or something and fight the end war, the final liberation war, because of course that could blow up into something, and that's the danger. Even if the Israelis start it, we don't know how calculated they're actually going to be. Are they just going to be psychopathic? And then what are the repercussions for that? Because if they go in a genocidal way against Lebanon, then we could be looking at the Iraqi militias. We could be looking at the Palestinian resistance in Syria, the Palestinian resistance in Lebanon, Amal movement in Lebanon, the Sunni groups in Lebanon, some of the Shia, some of the Christian groups in Lebanon. All the groups in Lebanon will come. Everyone will come. Maybe the Lebanese army might do something, but Lebanese army is relevant. It's more like a police force in terms of how it operates when it comes to the Israelis. It's like more domestic. Anyway, you might see that Iran get involved. Ansar Allah will definitely launch unprecedented strikes. And then what? When you've got hundreds upon hundreds, Hezbollah alone, just its standing army, and these are ready-to-go fighters. These are not like the special forces units and militias it's allied with, or 100,000 men. So you're talking about possibly hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of fighters against the Israelis. The Israeli army is not capable of disbanding one of the armed groups in the Gaza Strip. It's failed. What are the chances that they're going to be able to fight against the people that defeated ISIS, the people that were on the battlefield and literally fighting against one of the toughest opposition you can? Crazy, suicidal, drugged up, fanatics running at them with suicide vests and car bombs and throwing everything at them. That's who you're fighting.
Supported, armed, and backed by the U.S. government in Israel, just to make sure we point that out. Go ahead.
And those people that fought them and defeated
ISIS, I'm talking about, in case that wasn't unclear. Go ahead. Go ahead.
But like those people that fought those, are they going to have any trouble against Israel? No. And the passion with which they will fight after seeing what they've seen in Gaza, they'll fight like hell. And I think, if you think October 7 was chaos, what will happen in the north, not from Hezbollah, Hezbollah is more controlled. From those other militia groups that will come in, Israel will be completely wiped out, in my opinion. And at that point, Israel might launch nuclear weapons.
Right. The Samson option direction, I think that's very possible.
So that's why this is such a dangerous situation, because that's the thing. These people have been watching a genocide take place. They've been watching all these massacres every single day, and they're there with their weapons. And these are the people that are bloodthirsty. They've been hunting ISIS for years. That's what their jobs are. If they're given the ability to go in and fight the Israelis, they'll fight like hell, and they won't stop. And I don't think you can control all of these people. What if they send other militia forces might join in that are also in Syria, who are less controlled than the Iraqi, for instance, or the other militias? It's such a sensitive situation that it could blow out of hand. However, I do believe that eventually we are going to see a war between Lebanon and Israel, and it's heating up to that point.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I see similar. I mean, one thing that I worry about more than anything to kind of end on is the idea that one thing you pointed out, the obvious kind of irrational action of the cornered animal, realizing, you've already lost, so why not kind of a, idea. But just the idea that you have elements of this, the more extreme parts of their government that might be fighting in a different direction of first and foremost to realize that the areas we all just discussed that you highlighted right there are all illegally occupied. So it's the same dynamic of Gaza, whether it's Lebanon or Syria, they're illegally occupied. And so they have a right to armed resistance in that dynamic. Now, obviously, that's not just anywhere they want, but that's an element I think they're aware of. And so I think that is becoming more of a common reality. And even Israel's propaganda, Hasbar, they know that people are talking about this. So that becomes irrational. You got these elements that might, same thing I pointed out about the Azov movement, Ukraine, realizing the diminishing support might use that to carry out a massive action, blame it on Iran kind of a thing. Like you can see how that could spin out of control. It would force the elements like US government to back it. What else are they going to do, right? They're already invested. And all of a sudden they carry this out. And just to kind of, I think that's a worry that I have that something like that might happen, which is always there. My hope is that saner heads prevail ultimately, which is a dangerous hope for people like this. But I think that's what we're seeing play out is, it's not necessarily about the fact that the US government or anybody else cares about the right thing or the people. I think they've proven that's not true, but that they're opportunists and that they see that they're losing support from the world. And so that might drive them to just recognize that the juice isn't worth the squeeze anymore to back this belligerent government, but they're one themselves. But that's where I hope that we end up, And so I'm hoping the information that we're bringing across right now will inform the average person enough to be able to recognize where they should be standing and where they should be applying that pressure to stop something like this. So, I just appreciate your time on this, brother. And I think your insight is always very valuable in this conversation. And as you guys listening, that he'll be writing more for TLAV coming up very, whether it's tomorrow or the next day, coming up soon, there's more to be coming out. So anything you want to leave us with there, Robert? Any other points you want to make before we wrap today?
No, I just say I'd second what you said, that that I hope the cooler heads do prevail. But my hope for that has diminished greatly, I'd say, unfortunately, for what we see in the United States do and how it's behaved and how ridiculously stupid that government is and how it's dealt with this situation. And right now, I suppose as a final remark is, I believe that the countries in the region now believe that Israel is not a neighbor that they can live with. Before, I think that they were looking to manage the situation, that they were actually looking at, international law says, blah, blah, blah. At this point, I think because Israel has carried out the genocide option against the Palestinians and has committed such horrors that the Arab world no longer wants to live with Israel. And I think even on the international stage now, the question of whether Israel should exist is now on the table. Wasn't before. We were talking about 1967 borders, a two-state solution. I think now we're back to the original question of 1947 and the partition resolution. Should this state, as it is, right, as it wants to be, exist? Or should there be a state with equal rights? And how, if this state doesn't bow down, is that to come, and it doesn't strike a deal and doesn't give Palestinians their human rights, how is that achieved? And I think the military option is there on the table. And that's what's happened as a result of Israel's actions, which wouldn't have been the case if Israel reacted in a different way. So I think we're heading to more conflict, unfortunately, more war, and we just have to hope that the civilians are somehow spared, at least they're given honorable burials when they're killed in the future. That's what I would say there. Sorry to end on a grim note here, but unfortunately, we're in very difficult times, So
yeah.
And I appreciate you having me on, and I ask everyone to subscribe and support you and all the work you're doing. Keep watching this show because we need shows like this, and we need this information to be able to come out and for people to actually question everything and to really apply that knowledge that is being provided on shows like this. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, brother. And I agree. And I hope that we can find a way past this. I mean, I know that we will, but I think that you're right that ultimately the way that it comes down to the fact that I think we have people in power that don't truly care about the things that they claim to care about. And it's going to come down to the people, like I think always, to force that change, you know? So I think your work is adding to that like so many others. So thank you, brother. And as always, everybody out there, question everything, come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant. 2013, Palestinian children tortured, used as shields by Israel, per the United Nations. Reuters. Israeli soldiers who used Palestinian boy, a 9-year-old, as human shields avoid jail. Defense for Children International, an international human rights group. Israel forces use 5 Palestinian children as human shields. That's 2023. This is from 2017. Generally, human shields. Since the beginning of the occupation in 1967, Israeli security forces have repeatedly used Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as human shields. Israeli soldiers routinely use Palestinian civilians as human shields by forcing them to carry out life-threatening tasks. It was also following a high court petition against this practice, which was filed by human rights organizations around the world in May 2002, that the IDF issued a general order prohibiting the use of Palestinians as a means of human shield against gunfire or attacks by the Palestinian side. But then it goes on to say, following the order, the use of human shields dropped sharply. However, the army did not construe as a human shield the use of Palestinians, provided they consented. The army continued the widespread use of this practice, which they referred to as the neighbor procedure. Following another petition filed by human rights organizations, the High Court of Justice ruled that this practice, too, violated international humanitarian law and that this thus was illegal. And guess what they've never stopped doing? Here is the Institute for Middle East Understanding, the neighbor procedure, Israel's use of Palestinian human shields from 2012. Human Rights Watch. During military operations, Israeli soldiers routinely coerced Palestinian civilians, including children, to perform life-endangering acts that assisted military operations, the practice known as the neighbor procedure. Now,